And what we see with low carb diets is that, especially when there's no carbs or very little carbs, like on a keto level, the liver is the predominant source of glucose. And when it runs low, it makes more glucose through gluconeogenesis. Well, that's driven by hormones like glucagon and cortisol, but primarily glucagon. That's the kind of the base level one that's always running high in those situations, in those diets. And so glucagon is telling the liver to put out glucose no matter what else is going on because our body's eating a certain amount of glucose.
What if I told you that your low carb diet could be the reason that your blood sugar is rising? Not because you cheated, but because you have been fighting the wrong enemy. 1 in 3 Americans have metabolic syndrome, and among those over 60, it's closer to 1 in 2. Worldwide diabetes has gone from 200 million in 1990 to 830 in 2022. And this is not slow drift, this is a huge explosion. And today's guest believes he knows the major reason why, and it is not from bread. I am Bonni London, the host of Healthy Rebel Speaks Out, and today's guest is Zane Griggs, who is a 25-year fitness and metabolic health coach, the author of Kicking Ass After 50, host of internationally ranked Healthy AF podcast, and one of the few people in this space willing to challenge the low-carb community from the inside out. He worked on ABC's Extreme Weight Loss and has spent decades watching the system fail real people in real time. So welcome, Zane. So happy to have you on today. Welcome, Zane. I'm so excited to have you here. But first, I just want to begin. If you could just tell us a little bit about what inspired you, what really got you interested and so passionate about this field.
Well, it was early on, my mid-20s, and I had noticed my uncles, for instance, all my dad's brothers had really struggled with heart disease, some form of cardiovascular disease or stroke, in their 50s and 60s. My dad wasn't, and he was a little bit younger, but he was also taking care of himself. He was exercising, he paid attention to his diet, but wasn't having the same issues that they were. And I saw a lot of diabetes on the other parts of my family, and I just didn't want that to be my outcome, and I didn't think it needed to be. And so it got me digging in, reading, experimenting with how to avoid metabolic disease and try to figure out what caused it. And then through the course of experimenting over several years, that led me into becoming a trainer and then a coach. And so, of course, most of my people were the clients that would come to me were dealing with some form of metabolic issue. And so it just kind of snowballed, and my curiosity has led me all the way through these years. That was 35, almost 40 years ago. So,
Wow.
I've been a coach professional for 28 years. So it's probably about 35 to 40 years. I started digging into this. I'm 55 now.
Well, it is amazing because back then, and we're from the same time, they
Mhm.
really didn't make the connection between diet and these things at all. And, myself, I had PCOS, which they never diagnosed, and acne, and they never said one peep that there was I had any control over anything. So how did you make that connection? That diet lifestyle may have some part of what happened in your family.
Well, again, it was seeing my dad so he watched his diet as well as we knew in the 80s, right? The 80s and 90s, things were a little different. And
Yeah.
but he was always exercising. And so that was like, if I'm going to be able to do anything, it's gotta start. It was like kind of my own kind of conclusion that it had to be something lifestyle related because genetically I could see differences depending on my, behaviors. So that's what got me digging in and just reading and experimenting. So, I was vegetarian for a number of years when I started I did juice fast, 7-day juice fasts at that time, and was, exercising all the time. I've been working out a lot in college, but this was like my first dietary experiment. Vegetarian crashed and burned on that. Did not work out, but did for 3.5 years as well as I could. Learned how to cook. Got into low carb and then a lot of intermittent fasting and fasted workouts for many years, for over a decade with the fasting and fasted workouts, and really burned out on that as well. We might get into that, but just the hormonal implications of that level of metabolic stress, I found were not ideal. So trying to trying to address the problem with extremes and found some limits, found some boundaries. But it was really a big experiment of reading and experimenting and asking people questions and just staying curious. And I think we should all stay curious, right? That's how we move forward. So it was really a journey of curiosity.
Absolutely. As we're constantly evolving, and even just now looking at the diets, and we're looking for like the miracle macronutrient that we should avoid. So I really want to begin with something that you have said that really sparked my interest, which was that strict carbohydrate or low carbohydrate diets can actually raise your blood sugar. Please explain this.
Well, we see it. I see it all the time. When I experienced it on low carb and intermittent fasting and on my fasted workouts, I had blood sugar around 95 milligrams per deciliter, which is not super high, but it's a little out of range and it bothered me. But then I started running into other people who are on keto, carnivore, much more restrictive with carbohydrates than I was, who had blood sugar over 100 to 120, and maybe had raising A1C. A buddy of mine, Brad Kearns, while he was writing the Keto Diet Revolution, which was a New York Times bestseller back in 2017, with Mark Sisson, who's, everyone knows Mark Sisson, Mark's Daily Apple and Primal Kitchen. They were writing this book together, and they're both very healthy. They're both ex-professional athletes. Brad is still competing at 60 years old, but he was waking up to blood sugar of 120 milligrams per deciliter in the morning, extremely, and he hadn't eaten for 10 hours. And maybe when he did, it was broccoli and protein, and maybe a square of chocolate or something. So we're seeing this with keto and carnivore, elevated blood sugar, elevated A1C. And that should tell us it's not about what they're eating. That comes back to a hormonal imbalance, what drives blood sugar? What elevates blood sugar? Why do diabetics wake up to elevated blood sugar of 200 or more when they haven't eaten in 10 or 12 hours? It's not what they ate. It's their liver dumping glucose into their bloodstream. And what we see with low carb diets is that, especially when there's no carbs or very little carbs, like on a keto level, the liver is the predominant source of glucose. And when it runs low, it makes more glucose through gluconeogenesis. Well, that's driven by hormones like glucagon and cortisol, but primarily glucagon. That's the kind of the base level one that's always running high in those situations, in those diets. And so glucagon is telling the liver to put out glucose no matter what else is going on, because our bodies need a certain amount of glucose. And so our bodies start to create what's called physiological insulin resistance. It's just a term to try to explain it. But what's really happening is now this gets a little nerdy, but a high glucagon to insulin ratio. So it's not so much looking at insulin in isolation or glucagon in isolation, but when glucagon is higher in ratio than insulin in the environment. And we see this in both diabetes, where they have elevated stress hormone, and that glucagon is driving the glucose from the liver and raising their blood sugar, especially that dawn effect that we talked about in the morning. And it's the same with a very low carb diet, like a ketogenic or carnivore diet. Glucagon is driving their blood sugar levels. Your brain needs a certain amount of glucose, right? And so the body will start to preserve some of that glucose by keeping the muscles from absorbing it in this low carb situations. So the muscles don't soak up all the glucose, so the brain still has it. So it's a preservation for brain function, is to keep whatever glucose is being made intact for the brain to absorb it, so the muscles don't soak it all up. But there's just a high pumping of blood sugar, as much as it can handle hormonally, because it isn't being consumed. And the other impact of not consuming carbohydrates is that we don't stimulate insulin as much either. So there's like almost a suppression of insulin, or it's just not being stimulated like it does when we consume carbohydrates The naturally occurring GLP peptides in our gut stimulate the release of insulin. But when that glucose is coming from the liver right into the bloodstream, we don't get that stimulation in our gut. And it can be a difference of a 50 to 70% decrease in insulin secretion. Well, if we have low insulin and high glucagon, then insulin is not going to be strong enough to move that blood sugar into tissues, and glucagon is going to keep pumping the blood sugar out. So that's what creates that imbalance, is that glucagon to insulin ratio, driven by just to a large degree, metabolic stress. In one case, it's metabolic disease. In another, it's a very low carb diet where glucose is being preserved, insulin isn't being stimulated, and glucagon is a primary driver of blood sugar.
So in the absence of consuming glucose, just so people can understand gluconeogenesis, where is the raw material coming from at that point?
Early on, it's coming primarily from, there's a substrate called lactate, which is a byproduct of glycolysis or exercise, but a lot of it comes from protein, which can come from muscle, skin, bone, so like collagen protein, which is in skin and bone, and the protein
Well,
that
you're
you
eating,
consume.
you're eating,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, your consumed protein as well. And so it would turn that protein into glucose through that. It's a very expensive process. It's a stressful process. It actually uses energy, or ATP, our cellular energy, to make it. So we actually end up losing some of our cellular energy trying to make it. There's ammonia byproducts, which you have to process. It's not a great process to rely on as your primary glucose source. It helps us get through, like between meals, it runs on a low normal. And if we're going without food, then it's a backup mechanism to prevent starvation and keep the brain functioning, and to give us glucose for our muscles to use when we need that extra energy. But it's not ideal. It's not an ideal process because it is so expensive and the energy that it uses, and it elevates this stress hormone, which also has some other downstream impact on thyroid. It can impact sex hormone production. I mean, insulin should be going up and down. And so when we have low suppressed insulin all the time, that's going to impact thyroid function. I mean, it doesn't tell the body it's a safe environment. So reduce thyroid, reduce metabolism. There's a lot of other downstream implications with the elevation of this stress hormone, glucagon, when we're relying on as our primary source of glucose, that aren't always accounted for or given enough attention in how they impact the body long term. But I've seen a lot of it where people are losing hair thinning, typical low thyroid symptoms, or symptoms of REDS, which is relative energy deficiency in sport. We see low libido, lower metabolism, things like that, brain fog. The other substrate is a backbone of fat. Some people think fat gets converted into glucose, but it's really, to get nerdy but precise, the
Well,
glycerol
we're doing
backbone.
it.
Yeah, the glycerol backbone of fat. So when we break down a triglyceride, there's a
Mhm.
glycerol that's holding those three fat cells together. They get released. The glycerol comes off that, but in most cases, early on, especially, it's a very small contributor, like 10% of what's needed, but it can increase as they talk about becoming fat adapted, or you get into ketosis where you start breaking down more fat. Well, then as you're breaking down more and more fat, there is more of that glycerol in there, and so that can offset some of the protein. But we're always using those three: protein, lactate, and that glycerol. We're not actually turning fat into sugar. Fat stays fat. So
Right. Not like the other way around.
right. No, sugar can be converted to fat, but not as often as people think. Not as much as people think.
Oh, well, that's good to know. Since we're coming up with the holidays here now. Now,
Yeah.
okay, typically when people are healthy and how the body is supposed to work,
Mm.
insulin would be kind of like the gatekeeper and communicate to the liver and say, okay, I don't need any more glucose. So what actually is interrupting this? What is causing this to break down?
The stress hormone elevates. So that's the elevation of the glucagon, which will override that insulin signaling. So really what's happening is, oh boy, it's the brain saying there's not enough energy. And that is being triggered by, so when the brain says there's not enough energy, then the stress hormones are elevated, and that's when those stress hormones can elevate, and the insulin, it'll be basically make the liver insulin resistant or ignore that insulin signaling to shut off. But at the root of that, one step upstream from there, is where we get into the mitochondria. And when we have an inefficient production of ATP, which is our cellular energy, when that is interrupted, that's what triggers the brain to say, hey, we're low on energy. We've got certain cells here that can't go more than a few seconds without adequate energy, or they'll start to die, especially in the brain. So it triggers a stress response of these hormones, the glucagon, adrenaline, cortisol. And those release free fatty acids into the bloodstream. So basically, stored fat is released in the bloodstream, and that signal to the liver to release glucose, despite the fact that insulin may be present, which would normally shut it off. In a healthy environment, would shut it off. So in a diabetic situation, let's say someone who's got metabolic disease, that's pretty common. Their brain thinks, despite having a caloric surplus, their brain may read this stressful situation as, or they're not making adequate to ATP as a starvation response. It's almost like we're not getting enough energy. I don't care what you ate. I don't care how much you ate. We're not getting enough energy. This is how I'm going to respond. And it elevates these stress hormones. In a very low carb diet, it's sensing where we have a lot of fat coming in. So those low carb diets, what's the dominant fuel? Fat. Well, fat is not an efficient energy source when it comes to oxygen consumption compared to glucose. Glucose is about 13% more efficient when it comes to making ATP compared to fat oxidation. And that may not sound like a lot, but to the brain, that's a big difference. And so when we have primarily fat coming in as our fuel, that creates a lower ATP production and more reactive oxygen species, more basically oxidative stress within that mitochondria. Or you think of free radicals. Okay, so reactive oxygen species are a form of free radical. So they create this cascade, this loop within the mitochondria of inflammation and interruption of moving those electrons down that electron transport chain. So that interrupts the energy production and can even cause some level of, over time, if it gets those reactive oxygen species build up, can add some level of mitochondrial DNA damage and cell death. But without low ATP production, we get that same stress response in the low carb situation as we do with diabetes, just on maybe to a lesser level, but it's the same hormonal response. Put out more energy. So there's more free fatty acids being released. There's more signal to the liver to spit out glucose because it's not coming in. The brain sees a lack of glucose coming in as a starvation response. We're not in a safe environment. This is winter, or there's not enough food present. It's to preserve us when there's a drought, a famine, winter, and we can't find food, and it slows us down. The other adaptation is to slow down our use of energy, which is the lower thyroid, the lower metabolism. It's just the lower sex hormones. You don't want to reproduce in an environment where there's a lack of energy or a lack of food or a lack of safety. So it all signals to the brain, we're not in a safe environment. We're not in a thriving environment. So let's bring down our energy usage and try to spit out as much of this excess fuel we have, the stored fuel we have on board until things change. And I can tell you, I've helped people coming from a ketogenic or carnivore diet just in the DMs. I'm like, add carbs, watch what happens. And when they add carbohydrates to their diet, their blood sugar comes down, their A1C comes down to normal levels. And I saw it my own. When I dramatically increased my carbohydrate intake, my blood sugar came from 95 down to around 80. My A1C, which was creeping up around 5.6, 5.7 sometimes, came down to 5.2. And my fasting insulin has always stayed 2.5 to 3. It's always stayed low. So it wasn't a high insulin issue. It was a high glucagon issue. It was a high stress hormone issue.
So now when you're talking, really low carb, I mean, we're talking below, like just to give me like grams and then what you added in. You know what I mean? Like
Okay,
what, like your definition of like,
low carb.
very low carb and then what you added in.
Okay, so carnivores typically don't eat any, right? They say they don't, but they'll get it in there. Keto typically to stay ketogenic, you're looking at like 10% or less of calories from carbohydrates, or some just say below 30 grams a day, which is
Hmm.
really low. I had days like that, and I did carnivore for 2 weeks. Didn't feel good, felt terrible, low energy, bad mood. You can ask my family. It was not fun. I didn't sleep well. So that was part of, I did that experiment. But for most of the time when I was experiencing this, I was in the 100 to 150 grams of carbs a day with fasted workouts and 16 to 18-hour fasts in a day, for most days of the week. So definitely under fueling as well. But when I increased my carbs, my initial jump was 250 to 300 grams a day, and I was tracking all this, and I saw an improvement in blood sugar came down to normal levels, a little drop in the A1C, and even my cholesterol, which had been creeping up in that high carb or that low carb, very high fat, higher fat meat environment, was high cholesterol, and it dropped about 25 to 30% as soon as I added the carbs. Went 250, 300. And then after about a year of that, I said, I'm going to take this up. And so I took it up closer to 400 grams of carbs a day, right around that, 350 to
Wow.
425. And felt amazing. Get these big pumps in the gym when I'm working out, and took blood work about 4 months after I started that. Blood sugar was still 79. A1C had dropped to 5.2. My fasting insulin was one of the lowest measurements I've ever had. It was like 2.4. And my visceral fat, I had a DEXA, and I dropped fat, probably about 7 pounds of fat, and my visceral fat was like point. For those, at this point, it's about 2 years of doing higher carb. So people, well, what about your liver? Visceral fat was right around 0.7 pounds of fat that's around in visceral area. So we're talking about less than half, talking about 9 ounces, pretty low.
Very low. Hmm.
Yeah, very low,
Yeah,
very
yeah,
low. I mean, you're a
yeah.
dietitian. 9 ounces of fat in your visceral area is lower than average, right?
Yes. Oh yeah. That,
So
that's amazing. It's shocking. So now where were you getting these carbs from?
fruit, primarily sweet potatoes, white rice, a little juice here and there, honey. I'm not afraid of honey. I put it in my coffee now. Um, And then every once in a while, I like a little dark chocolate. I just like kind of something enjoyable. I think what was great about the shift. So, but those my main sources of carbohydrates would be sweet potatoes, white rice, fruit. That's like the bulk with these other things coming in there. But man, I felt so. It was like a sense of freedom, like unrestricted. When I went there, it's like because at first I went in, like I don't know what's going to happen here. I don't know what the changes are going to be. I'm guessing. I think I know. I'm hoping I know, but I didn't really know until I did the blood work and I had the
And
the
how
DEXA
was your
scan.
total calories? How did that change at all? Your total calorie intake?
Not a lot. It stayed right around the 26 to 2,800 calories, which is not a lot of calories for someone my size. I don't think. There were times when it may have crept over 3,000. It just depends on how active I am. If I'm still hungry, I pay attention to my hunger. So I eat when I'm hungry. I don't deprive myself when I'm hungry. But I don't fast anymore at all. Definitely slept better. My HRV went up by
Wow, that
lowering those
sounds
stress hormones. Yeah, I mean, win-win. But so what happened was I dropped my, so when I took the carbs up to 400, I made sure I dropped my fat back. So I started really, so when increased my carb intake, I really started pulling back the fat. I'm like, okay, I'm doing higher carb and you pull the fat back to measure, to level out the calories. So I pulled the fat back to maybe closer to 40 grams a day. Well, I'm doing 400, 350, 400, 425 of carbs. That's when the fat started falling off. And man, it was like And my protein, I don't, instead of trying to do 1 gram per pound of body weight, I'm more like the zero point 0.6 to 0.75 grams per pound of body weight. So definitely took leaner protein, pulled that back to a moderate level because I'm not trying to oxidize protein to make glucose anymore, right? So I just need it for recovery and tissue. And much more than that, and you really begin to oxidize the protein for glucose. And so I'm consuming my glucose from my food sources, so I really don't need excess protein. So it was really a balancing of that, of the carbs with the protein and fat intake.
So what would you say to, the typical American who we'll just say someone in their 50s, somewhat sedentary, eating more like the standard American diet, and so I am thinking they're somewhat insulin resistant.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to that person, which is like the majority of people out there?
It is the majority of people. I would start with food quality,
Mm,
and that is getting rid of the ultra processed foods and sticking to whole food. If you notice, my carb sources were all single ingredient foods.
yes,
They have one ingredient, they have one name. You can say what you want about what's happened to how we farm fruit differently or potatoes or rice. They have one
sure,
ingredient. They're not ultra processed food. And if you compare that to what's in the aisles of your grocery store and the packages with, 15 different ingredients,
right,
there's no comparison. We have to work with what we have here, right? We live in the 21st century. We have 21st century stressors. We all live in light, right? We trying to live like some so-called ancestor did 2 million years ago, who maybe lived to the age of 25. I don't quite understand this whole idea of, to kind of go back to, let's be primal. It's like, well, you have a cell phone, you live in an air conditioned house, you fly in airplanes, you have a computer, you're staying up late with lights coming in your eyes. You have different stressors than someone would have had even 10,000 years ago. Because yeah, they had drought, famine. We've fixed some of these things. We've solved for some of these things, but we also have a technology issue that is stimulating our sympathetic nervous system, which is stress. So these stress hormones get stimulated by a lot more things than just food, right? A lack of sleep, constant light. This is we live in a modern environment. We need modern solutions, and the ultra processed food is the newcomer, the real newcomer to our diet, starting in the 20th century. And that's when our current epidemic of metabolic disease really began. Because in 1901, the obesity rate was 1%. As late as 1930, just 100 years ago, type 2 diabetes only impacted about 0.3% of the US population. And now you could arguably say 30% are at least diabetic or pre-diabetic, definitely struggling with some level of insulin resistance. The official numbers would say 13. That's still a huge number. So what changed? I mean, there has never been an epidemic like this in history of metabolic disease. And now we've exported these foods, exported our fast food to other countries, and they're seeing the same thing. We're seeing this metabolic disease spread in Australia, India, even China, Japan, Europe, South America. It's everywhere because we've exported our ultra processed food. Uh, that that's that should not be an argument. We should not argue over. We can argue over what is it in the ultra processed food that might be driving it, but I think if we look at history, rather than a science lesson, let's take a history lesson. We have 10,000 years of history of cultivating potatoes in South America and Africa, rice in Asia, and wheat in the Middle East. They're making bread even 10, 12,000 years ago from wheat. There was no metabolic disease, but we've been cultivating these plants for 10,000 years. And we have current populations that are eating 60 to 85% of their calories from carbs with no metabolic disease. They have great metabolic health, great heart health, no obesity, because they're not eating ultra processed food. They don't have the magic diet. They just have a lack of the toxin that we brought into
yeah.
ours.
What are they missing specifically?
In my opinion, which I think
Yes.
is pretty well founded and educated, just because of my own curiosity. I'm not bragging. I didn't come up with it. I'm following the
The
science and
sign.
trying to dig in and trying to
Mhm.
understand it. But it's the ultra processed, it's the processed polyunsaturated oils that are in all of our food and used in every restaurant. That's the common denominator. And that's what we don't see in these indigenous populations who are eating from their environment. They are eating whole food. And these polyunsaturated oils like soybean oil, cottonseed oil, canola, safflower, sunflower, they are they make up about 20% of the average American's total calories. And they're the soybean oil is 57% of the average American's fat intake. It's not from beef, it's not from chicken, it's not from bacon, it's from soybean oil. It makes up half of the fat, sources of fat. That doesn't include the other polyunsaturated fats or the what you're getting from your meat and your eggs and so forth. That's just half the source. So these are, and they didn't exist prior to 1910. So that's when Crisco was released. It was cottonseed oil and it was, Crisco. And then we came with soybean oil and all these other oils. And now every restaurant uses them, right? We cook the French fries in them. We cook all our food in it, cook the veggies in them. They're in everything. They're in your cereal, your bread, salad dressings, even though they say olive oil on them. Margarine, they're pervasive. And these impact back to the mitochondria, these impact the efficiency of this ATP production. And so again, we have this, if we have something causing the inefficiency or an inefficient production of ATP, which is our cellular energy, then we get the stress response again. Same stress response, hormones, glucagon, adrenaline, cortisol, signaling to release all this extra energy, this stored energy from our liver, from our fat cells, and excessively to make up for the lack of energy. And that begins that same process of insulin resistance and lipotoxicity, with just an abundance of poorly metabolized energy flowing through our body. So it's the seed oils basically it's that oxidative stress. So there are studies that unfortunately are not recognized by our common or usual nutrition mainstream information. But this is studied with neuroscience, with heart failure. There are studies in those verticals and those silos of studies where they look at the impact of polyunsaturated fat within the mitochondria and how that impacts the oxidative stress and the production of ATP. And so what makes, I don't know, how sciencey can we get here, Bonnie?
Well, I'm loving it. I think this is there's so much confusion
There is.
about this and about linoleic acid, and there's a lot of studies saying how it's heart healthy, and the American Heart Association is all very supportive of all of these oils and how it helps the heart, and where the confusion is. And of course linoleic acid, and I like that I believe you differentiate, of course, between the highly processed seed oils and eating an almond, which also contains linoleic acid.
Well, yeah. So these fats, PUFA fat, so polyunsaturated fat, has been in our diet previously. So if we go back to say 1850, okay, we would have eaten, different populations would have had a certain level of nuts or seeds or grains that had, or even fish that had some of these fats in them. But back then, that amount coming into our system would have been a single digit percentage, not 20%. It would have been 3 to 5% is considered the typical like ancestral level, right? That comes in through the
Mhm.
diet, depending on where you live in the world. And so at that 3 to 5%, we don't really have a problem. I mean, these are considered the essential oils, right? Omega 6 and omega 3s, but we only need 1 or 2% of our fat. Well, basically, we only need 1 or 2 grams, to be honest. 1 or 2 grams of each of those coming in for the essential fats. They're polyunsaturated fats. 1 or 2 grams of omega 6, 1 or 2 grams of omega 3 for those functional levels. But we're eating 20% from these, just the omega 6. And so we can't say a little, that fallacy of a little was more, a little is good, more must be better. Well, no, there's a good amount and then there's too much. And so when we have too much of these polyunsaturated fats in our mitochondria, that creates a lot of oxidative stress within what's called the cardiolipin, or the lining of that inner mitochondrial membrane, where we make energy, where these electrons are being passed along. And they've observed this in multiple species, not just humans, not just mice, in reptiles, other mammals, birds, fish, and the impact of polyunsaturated fats within the mitochondria in each of these species. And so this is not a theory. This is observed. So there's an oxidative or peroxidative index. So what makes that compares fatty acids. So saturated fat, what makes something saturated versus unsaturated, is, to simplify it, is the way the molecule is shaped. So in a saturated fat, it's saturated because it has this fence of hydrogen atoms that goes all the way around the fatty acid. It looks like a little fence when they draw it. It has little H's, right? They go all the way around. There's no openings to allow an oxygen molecule, a free radical, to come in and try to steal an electron. A monounsaturated fat, which is what we find in olive oil, olives, avocado, a lot of beef fat is made up of monounsaturated fat. It's like 40-45% monounsaturated and 40-45% saturated, very little polyunsaturated. And it has one opening, has one called a double bond. Instead of having that H going all the way around making the fence, it has one opening. It's called a double bond. It looks like a little equal sign when they draw it. And so that creates a small amount of vulnerability to oxidative stress. It has a peroxidation index of 0.025. That's how the scientists define it. It's 0.025, so a very small peroxidation index. The next one up is this linoleic acid, omega-6, which has two double bonds, or two openings where oxidative stress can get in. It has a peroxidation index of 1. So we've gone 0.025 to 1. So with a second double bond, it is 40 times more susceptible to oxidation. And with each double bond, we see a multiple going up of a peroxidation index of, for, let's say, omega-3, which has 6 open double bonds. So omega-3 is much more susceptible to peroxidation. It has 6 double bonds. Peroxidation index is like 8, which means it's 320 times more susceptible to peroxidation than that olive oil. So this is that. You don't have to remember all that. You don't have to maybe even fully understand it. Just understand it that they are more reactive to oxygen being in there, which we have to use to burn it. But that means they're more vulnerable. They're more kind of like the difference between something's going to burn nice and slow or something that's going to explode. That's what that means. They're going to be more reactive. They're going to be more likely to cause oxidative stress within that mitochondria and interfere with that ATP production. And so the more of these, so the ideal environment with these people who are actually studying this, who are actually looking at this problem, find is that the ideal mix is some saturated and some monounsaturated, and we have a perfect mix that keeps it fluid, nice and fluid in there, nice moving, but not so susceptible to this oxidative stress. But the more polyunsaturated fat that comes in there, there's no more benefit to the fluidity because PUFA is much more fluid in a warm environment. There's no more benefit, but there's a lot more susceptibility to this oxidation, which is what creates, like I mentioned before, it creates susceptibility of the DNA of that mitochondria to be damaged. It creates a leaking of protons through the membranes. The membranes are more permeable, so they're losing energy, like a dam that's like got holes in it, essentially. You're trying to get all the water to go through a hydroelectric dam, but then you got holes in the dam, so they're not making electricity, they're just flowing through, right? And then you've got where enough of it escapes that it actually can trigger apoptosis, which is cell death. So this is, all of that comes down to less efficient ATP production and an alert going on in the brain if there's enough of that going on. So what's happening at a small level, our bodies can manage it with some endogenous antioxidants like glutathione. But when the oxidative stress becomes so high that our antioxidants can't handle it, And with these PUFA, they're creating these things like aldehydes, essentially. They are like 4-H-E. If you start looking in the research, you'll see 4-H-E mentioned. And it's these aldehydes that last a lot longer than a free radical. They last for minutes in there instead of seconds. And so they're creating a lot more oxidative stress as well. And it's like a toxin to our cells. And so the volume of that, as that increases, the less we can handle with our own endogenous antioxidants. And so the more, as they get overwhelmed, then we start having these problems, this breakdown. And that is why I believe that's the driver of metabolic disease, because it creates the same stress response from the glucagon and cortisol and so forth, which and this whole loop. What has been studied? There was a guy, Stefan Guillenet, who did a review of studies of adipose tissues when they do a biopsy of adipose tissue in Americans that range from 1959 to 2009, looking at the amount of linoleic acid, this omega-6, in fat tissue. And what he saw was it increased from 9% in 1959 to 21.5% in 2009. Well, that can only come from our diet. Our body doesn't make polyunsaturated fat. That's why it's essential. That's considered essential. We need 1 or 2 grams of it. But what our body makes is saturated fat. And it can turn saturated fat into monosaturated fat, but we can't make the PUFA, the polyunsaturated fat. So if we have this building up in our adipose tissue, in our fat tissue, over the period of decades, that's because we're consuming it. It can only come in through our diet. And so as we see that think about what happened from 1959 to 2009 in terms of metabolic disease. It ramped up, but 2.5 times more of these fats stored in our adipose tissue of the average American. So there's just a lot of we've got mechanistic science showing how this could happen, what happens in there, and then we've got correlative population, science looking at the increase of metabolic disease over the last 50 to 60, 70 years. That correlates really well with the increase in polyunsaturated fats in our diet. We used to cook with tallow. We used to cook with lard. Even popcorn once upon a time was cooked in coconut oil in the movie theaters. McDonald's used to use tallow. They don't use tallow anymore. So we've seen a shift in our food system and a shift in levels of disease, and we have the mechanistic science to look at it if you look in the right place. Now, those studies you mentioned that show a decrease in blood sugar or a decrease in LDL, let's say, or a shift in the LDL to HDL ratio, those can all be true while this is happening. It's not an either or. That could be happening. They're looking in the blood. What I'm talking about is happening in the mitochondria. And this can be happening in the mitochondria with no indicators of it happening, of it shown in the bloodstream. One of the reasons that we see a decrease in cholesterol with these oils is that because they're oxidative, they get oxidized in the liver when they're being formed. We make cholesterol in our liver. Most of our cholesterol comes from our liver, 80%. And so when it gets oxidized within the liver because of all these polyunsaturated fats, it gets damaged. And so the liver just doesn't release it. It's damaged before it leaves the factory. So it's not making less cholesterol. We're just damaging it before it leaves. And so it doesn't get sent out. Now, that's more, to me, more of an indicator. You could say, oh, great, we have less cholesterol, but it's more of an indicator of the oxidative stress that's happening. What happens when we oxidized cholesterol in the heart? Right? Most of the plaque in our heart is the cholesterol in it has been oxidized. It's an oxidized LDL. So when this is happening in the heart muscle, what we see is an oxidized cholesterol attracting the attention of macrophages, the immune system. So we get macrophages taking it and then going stuffing away as plaque. The macrophages are attracted to the oxidized or damaged cholesterol, and that's what makes the plaque. This is triggering all of these diseases. In the brain, it's triggering an oxidation of the fats and an impairment of glucose oxidation or glucose usage in the brain, which is why we start having all these problems with tangles and so forth, and the lack of blood flow, basically the plaque building up in the brain with neurodegenerative diseases, is from the oxidation of the fats and the lack of glucose metabolism or impaired glucose metabolism in the brain. It's the same process in different organs, with
So it
each having its
sounds,
own symptom.
so then you combine this. First of all, just thinking about the overall diagnosis that people have, the obesity, diabetes, heart disease, with these as a result of the oxidative stress, which I would
Hmm.
just mention that. So I do, of course, in-depth blood chemistry, as I'm sure you do, and everyone has oxidative stress.
Yes.
If you're wondering. But I'm wondering if when you're combining now this diet and someone, oh, I'm going to clean up, I'm going to do a fast, I'm going to start intermittent fasting, I'm going to go on a low keto diet. When you combine that, what are people facing at that point? I mean, to me, this sounds dangerous.
Well, because they've been storing this fat in their fat tissue
Hmm.
for decades, for their whole life. That's how this was formed. So now they've stored it up. If let's say 21%, like that biopsy study showed, 21% of their body fat is PUFA. It takes about 680 days. The half life in our body of this polyunsaturated fat is 680 days. So you might go, if you didn't ingest any more of it, it would take you about 2 years to go from 20% to 10%. The ideal level is like less than 5. So even if they didn't ingest any more of it, it would be it would take a long time to get it down.
Have
Um,
you had yours
so
biopsied? I'm just curious.
no, I haven't. I'm scared too. It doesn't sound like fun. They take a biopsy of your calf,
Okay.
but
Oh, okay. Just curious.
it's I know, like, but think about what the fat they're releasing. So if you go on a low carb, high fat diet and you have these stress hormones say, hey, let's put out more fat, what are you spitting out into your system? PUFA. Like a 20% of your body fat is just saying, so you're putting the same fuel that caused the problem back into your system. That's why some of these studies are so, in my opinion, irrelevant that they're doing with on PUFA when they say, oh, we looked at their blood, we gave them this oil, we gave them a blood. Wait a minute. Who's your control group? Because everyone in your study, especially a lot of times with these groups, they're all diabetic or they're all hypertensive. They all have some form of metabolic disease. When they do these groups, these studies to lower their blood sugar, to lower their cholesterol, they're already hyperinsulinemic or hyperlipidemic, and have high blood sugar. Or they have metabolic disease of some form. So you already got a sick population they're doing these studies with. So they've got this fat in their system. There's no control group. They have no washout period to take someone down, like I said, through that to where they lower the amount of this in their system, in their body fat, and take it out of their diet. These people are not changing their diet. They're just supplementing the group that they're testing with more oil. They're either giving it to them in a shake or in a spoonful or a pill. They're just giving them more oil. A lot of times it's flaxseed or sesame oil too. It's not like the hardcore canola that's been fried in the French fryer for a week when you eat it, but it's this sesame oil. Oh, look, they improved. It's like, well, improve compared to what? You have no control group. Everyone's still eating their same diet. You gave them a little extra of some oil that can damage their cholesterol, or maybe it pulls energy out of their bloodstream. But we're talking about subtle changes with no real difference in the two groups other than the spoonful you're giving them. How is that a viable study? The,
And then, right, what about, I'm sure I would love to hear your view of the Minnesota study that has come out now
oh,
that was buried.
the Minnesota coronary experiment?
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah. But originally that was one of Ansel Keys's big
Mhm.
studies, and they buried that evidence because they saw really, so they replaced saturated fat with a polyunsaturated fat and saw reduced cholesterol. They got reduced cholesterol, but all-cause mortality went up. So there was actually a percentage. It was like for every like 20, I think, certain number of milligrams, like maybe it's 20 milligrams of cholesterol that dropped, they saw an increase percentage of all-cause mortality. So it was like inverse. Cholesterol went down, death rate went up. And it was very similar with the Sydney diet heart study. Same thing. They gave a margarine, I believe, or some sort of safflower oil in margarine form versus saturated fat. And they had an increase in heart disease, actually, and all-cause mortality with those who were consuming the polyunsaturated fat. And so it's a really that's stuff that they don't want out. That doesn't make the news for a reason. And it was Chris. I can't think of his last name now. Chris, who brought out both those studies. I'm blanking on his name. You probably know who it is.
Not the one who, oh, Chris Nobby?
No, not Chris Kenobi. No,
Not
this guy
Chris
is
Kenobi.
Chris.
Another Chris.
Chris. He's a researcher.
Okay.
But he brought out both the buried evidence from both of these studies and showed that. It's by those who disagree with it, they're just saying, oh, that's meaningless. What does that mean? Well, who cares? What does that mean? But I know, yeah, Chris Kenobi has a lot of great correlative data on population data on how these
Yeah,
seed
I
oils
think it's
correlate much more with metabolic disease than sugar does.
right. Just looking at like the Asians, right? Because there definitely is genetic components to this, and
Yeah.
I'm sure you could speak to like people's fat threshold and what that means. And if you look at China and India and what's been going on there over the last decades.
Oh yeah. So, yeah. As soon as we exported McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken to Japan, like shortly in the 70s. Shortly after that, they started having their health markers which were phenomenal started decreasing, started having more of these metabolic issues. But yeah, so Asians. So we're talking about Asian continent, India, China, Japan, tend to have what's called a lower personal fat threshold, which means that their body fat, so the adipose tissue, the fat that's under the skin, the subcutaneous fat that's on your arms and legs and so forth, uh, they tend to gain less fat, but they don't make more fat cells. What they do get is inflamed fat cells if they get overstuffed, and so those fat cells that are inflamed start spilling out inflammatory markers like cytokines, and this other fat gets free fatty acids gets shuttled into the visceral area and starts storing visceral fat. Plus, they're releasing all this inflamed fat and cytokines, which impairs ATP production once again in the mitochondria, which drives the metabolic disease. So they'll get metabolic disease without necessarily getting obese. They might have some belly fat or visceral fat. They see the belly pooch, but with skinnier, thinner arms and legs. Whereas a Northern European makes great fat. For some reason, they tend to get obese first, then so they have a higher personal fat threshold, and they're going to make more fat before they become diabetic.
Right. Well, it seems to me that it would be, I don't know, you tell me. And I love also, and this is what you mentioned way earlier, just relative to the carbs, about
Mm-hmm.
eating white rice specifically. Because if you look at, I'm just thinking about the Asian populations, but even, we always look at the Mediterranean diet, and I've
Right.
never seen a whole grain baguette in all the times I've been to France. Not once.
No.
I'm just, I'm
No.
just saying.
You
Or a
can't find.
whole,
Yeah, I remember going over there trying to find wheat bread. I didn't find it until I went to Germany.
I
You
mean,
can't.
I'm just saying,
Yeah,
yeah.
the Mediterranean diet doesn't include hard whole grains, lots of dark bread.
All right. Well, obviously, there has been so much misinformation out there, and I'm sure you, like myself, spend half of the time getting people to unlearn everything we believe to be true from like 1985. So I guess
Absolutely.
now you mentioned Whole Foods, but I guess what would be the biggest couple things you might tell someone to do?
Well, I would tell someone, yeah, focus on single ingredient food as your primary food source. You got to read labels. Avoid the polyunsaturated oils as much as possible. If you can do that, you will avoid disease. You don't have to have a perfect diet, but you can. If you avoid those, you have a lot of freedom, a lot more freedom in what you can eat and in how you feel and how much energy you have and how much better you sleep. So avoid the polyunsaturated fats, oils in cooking, in restaurants if you can, in the ingredients of food that you buy, and stick to really a lot of single ingredient foods. Cook at home as much as possible. Uh, that 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 is really the big part. But carbohydrates really, glucose is the most efficient fuel source we have for making ATP. As I mentioned before, it's about 13% more efficient than fat. Uh, and so that if that can be your primary energy source, that
Mhm.
you'll be historically accurate with what all of our ancestors have done for the last 10 or 12,000 years. And you don't have anything to fear because it's the PUFA that's causing the problems or the inefficiencies in our diet. When we have a high fat, when fat becomes the primary fuel, then we start having these inefficiencies in mitochondria making ATP because that fat will block the entrance of glucose oxidation. So the mitochondria can only metabolize one fat or glucose at one time. So not in the whole body, but in a particular cell. So it's happening. We're metabolizing fat and glucose all the time
The
in our
donut.
bodies in different cells. We never stop burning fat. So don't let people tell you, oh, if you eat carbs, you stop burning fat. No, we're always burning fat. We're always using fat for structure, for hormones, for energy. But it's secondary. It's a backup fuel, or for when we're sitting on the couch, right? It's at rest. It's fine. It can be a little slower. Our primary fuel should be glucose. And so having more whole food carbohydrates like the fruit, or single ingredient, I'm going to say single ingredient because you can have some juice, you can have some honey, but you have single ingredient whole foods, a little bit of well-sourced protein, obviously not processed protein, but well-sourced protein, not an excessive amount, and then and some fat in there for enjoyment, for hormone production, for structure. It doesn't have to be overly restrictive.
So just
And
to
I
be
think that's the
clear,
good news.
yeah, just to be crystal clear, I can put
Yep.
butter on my potatoes again? No.
Absolutely. But we're not
Okay.
eating sticks of butter like you see a lot of influencers do who are in that keto
Yes.
carnivore world sitting there eating a
Yes.
stick of butter on the beach. It's just like, you're weird. And some of them, they don't look the part. You don't look that healthy. But, some do. And they're selling this. And it's like, that's not congruent with how historically how any ancestors from anywhere in the world ate, and it's not how we ate 120 years ago before we had this issue with metabolic disease. And so it's just really we have to get back to a little bit of common sense, and it's hard to with all of the voices, all of the influences coming in, and a lot of misinformation from our mainstream.
And people are looking for the quick fix, which really helps me with my final question that I really want your voice on, which in light of everything that you have shared today, how do you feel about I actually heard now it is the top selling pharmaceutical now in the world, which is the weight loss medications, the GLP-1s, which is now allowing people to lose crazy amounts of weight
Yeah.
in a very, very short period of time.
Mm. Okay. Wow. It's conditional. I'm not going to say yes or no because because it depends. It really does depend, and it depends on how you use it. So, like any tool, how you use that tool is going to determine your outcomes. I think it's unfortunate that people are being told you may never come off of this, that you might be on this forever. I think it's unfortunate people are being told that. I think it could be for someone who's very metabolically challenged, sick, it can be a great tool to help them start making habit changes with their diet if they have some runaway diabetes, blood sugar issues, or hunger might be very triggering to them. And so it helped them make better decisions on small doses. Now, I'm not a doctor, not giving medical advice.
Sure.
The ideal situation in my mind would be small doses in cycles of like 6 or 8 week cycles. Come on, come off, come on, come off. So you don't develop a resistance to it. And you can get that small dose, give you the edge you need while you make changes to your diet and exercise and sleep routine. Because those are the big levers where you really make changes and where you'll be able to come off of it because you're not so dependent on it. Where most of the change happens with diet, exercise, and sleep improvements, then you can continue those habits on after you leave the GLPs behind because you no longer need them. So using it in small doses for cycles to keep
Like
your
pulsing it.
sensitivity to it. What's
Like
that?
pulsing it is what you're saying.
Pulsing in a sense, like do a
I
6 or 8
no,
week.
I think that is fantastic, and of course, seeking out professional guidance because I'm sure
Yes.
you've seen this. I've seen many people just eating the same crap basically, but just less of it, and
Oh yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
so
They waste away.
that,
They they waste away. They get more fat, less muscle. So they might
and you
lose
can.
total weight, but their body composition doesn't really improve that much.
And hence what people are talking about, and plastic surgeons are going crazy with the Ozempic face. And you hit the nail on the head because both of us measure people constantly on their body composition because that is it. And we've both helped a lot of people lose, 100 pounds weight, and they look
Yeah.
fantastic. And why? What is the difference? Muscle.
Yeah.
They maintain
It's
muscle.
you've rebuilt your metabolism.
Oh yeah. Game changer.
Hmm.
Well, this has been great, and I want to hear how people can get in touch with you and
Oh,
what's going on with you
thank you. Well,
this year.
my website's the easiest place to find me at zanegriggs.com. I mean, to find information about me, I should say. I'm pretty active on Instagram at Zane Griggs Fitness. But what I have, I can let people, see a little peek into how I train or coach my clients. I have a free download. It's called Free 40 Plan, free40plan.com. It's my Fit Over 40 plan. And just gives people a little insight as to how I structure diet, exercise, recovery. It's got some kind of optimal ranges for metabolic and sex hormones on there to shoot for optimal versus normal, right? Because we don't want to be the average of normal. If you take a look around, we want to be optimal. So that gives a little insight as to how I approach all these topics we discussed. So that's free40plan.com.
Fantastic. And I am going to tell everyone you need to share this with someone you love that needs to hear this information, which is many, many people that need to hear this. This is a wake-up call. Honestly, it's even going to change what I do relative to carbohydrates. And so, no, thank you so much. This has really been a pleasure. So,
Thank you,
thank
Bonnie. I enjoyed
you.
talking to you. It's great to see you again.